issue. And the idea is that there were these various Christianities, each of which had somewhat different views of Jesus and who he was and what he taught, and these competing Christianities were really incompatible with each other. So in 313 AD, the worst persecution of the church in its history ended. So the vast majority of these bishops are people who were still bishops, they were still leaders in the church, okay? 10 years later, these are guys who had stood up to Caesar, right? They had stood up to the empire. They had done so at the risk of their lives. These were not the kind of guys who were inclined to just buckle when the emperor said something. Hello, welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Last week we began kind of a condensed study of historical issues that people wrestle with when they think about the Christian faith. And we talked about the conquest of Canaan, the killing of the Canaanites. We talked about slavery, and slavery both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, as well as modern arguments about slavery. And then we talked about the Crusades, and we tried to answer some of the chief questions that people have about the Crusades. So today I want to go on and talk about two other subjects that are important and that you're very likely to encounter if you've not already encountered them. And one has to do with the question of orthodoxy and diversity in the early church. There's an argument out there, we'll see here in a few minutes, there's an argument out there that what we think of as the orthodox, small o, the orthodox faith of the church, the historic faith of the church. There's scholars out there, and of course many people, many just average citizens have this impression that the Orthodox faith was not necessarily the faith of the early church. And so that's an issue that we need to talk about. And then the second area that I want to talk about is the whole relationship of Christianity as it interfaced with the culture. What was the influence that Christianity had on particularly Western civilization? And as you'll see, there's a great deal of misunderstanding about Christianity's role in Western civilization. And so those are the two areas that we want to talk about today. And of course, again, I have a list of resources for you. Just very quickly, Kostenberger and Kruger's book, The Heresy of Orthodoxy, talks about that very issue I was just talking about just now. What did the early church believe, and how do we know what the early church believed? Or was it just something that was added later? Rodney Stark has a couple, actually he's written a number of good books, but a couple in particular that relate to what we're talking about both last week and today. The book How the West Won, referring to Western civilization, and then the book The Triumph of Christianity. David Bentley Hart has written a book that deals with just a lot of misunderstandings, what he calls delusions, particularly that atheists like to propagate about Christianity, and he addresses those in a very thorough way. James Hannon has written a book, God's Philosophers. It talks about the intellectual development that occurred during the medieval era, the era that sometimes many people refer to as the Dark Ages, okay? And he demonstrates in his book, God's Philosophers, that that's clearly not the case. Larry Hurtado's book, Destroyer of the Gods, talks about the impact of Christianity on the Roman Empire and on the pagan world, and how Christianity displaced paganism, both in the Roman Empire and in Western civilization. Then there's a couple questions about, there's some questions about the Council of NIcea and the Nicene Creed. And there's a lot of misunderstanding there. So I have a couple resources for you there. Tim Barnett has written a superb article, a substantial article, that's available at the Stand to Reason website that you can read. And then there's a lecture, or I shouldn't say a lecture, it's kind of just, it's a video, kind of a little video movie, it's about 10 minutes long or whatever, on the truth about the Council of NIcea. So it's very easy to watch, and just it's loaded with a lot of helpful information about the Council of NIcea. So those are some resources about things that we're going to be talking about today. So I talked about this idea, I just mentioned this idea that's floating around out there, being propagated out there, that the early church really didn't necessarily believe what we believe is the historic Christian faith, and that there were a number of other what they call Christianities out there. And this, really the root of this is something called the Bauer-Ehrman thesis. Okay, Bauer was a very well-known scholar, a German scholar back before World War II, and he developed this thesis back in the mid-30s, and of course that was in Germany, and it was just prior to the war, and so it just kind of got buried for a while. But after the war, it really kind of caught fire. It made its way to the United States, and it's been enhanced and developed by Bauer-Ehrman, who of course is a contemporary of us. He's an agnostic or atheist New Testament historian. And he's very popular. The media likes to cite him and quote him and that sort of thing. And so we refer to it as the Bauer-Ehrman thesis. And according to this thesis, in the early years, in the early centuries of the church, the first and second, third centuries of the church, that sort of thing, there were multiple Christianities. Okay, so there were different Christianities, none of them really with any more legitimate claim to being authentic, okay, than any of the others. So there are these various, quote, Christianities that believed different things. And this hypothesis is based on the belief that you have these kind of competing, incompatible understandings of who Jesus was, what Jesus taught, what Jesus claimed about himself, who Jesus was, basically, is the issue. And the idea is that there were these various Christianities, each of which had somewhat different views of Jesus and who he was and what he taught, and these competing Christianities were really incompatible with each other. And the argument, as it goes, is that each one of these different multiple Christianities were located in various geographical locations. They were centered in different geographical locations. So the idea is that in Alexandria, in Egypt, that the early church was primarily Gnostic. In Ephesus, which is of course on the west coast of Asia Minor, the idea is either that church was predominantly either Gnostic or perhaps Docetic. Then there's Edessa, which is to the eastern end of what we think of as Turkey today, and supposedly the Christianity that was dominant there was Marcionism. And then Rome itself, the Christians in Rome, the church in Rome, during these very first centuries, these early centuries, was their view of Jesus is what we think of today as the Orthodox view, okay? But according to the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, none of these theologies, none of these interpretations of Jesus had any claim to credibility or authenticity over the others, okay? And then the idea is that the Roman Church, through just the power of manipulation and political power, because they had supposedly Emperor Constantine backing them up, forced its version of Christianity on all these other churches, all these other Christianities, so that the, quote, Orthodox faith was imposed on these other localities and these other, quote, Christianities, and so they were suppressed, they were extinguished, and so the reason we have the Orthodox faith today, and we believe it's the historic faith, and we believe that this is what Jesus thought and Jesus taught about himself and about a number of other things. The reason we believe that is simply because through political power and manipulation, all other voices were squelched, and so we have what we think of today as the Orthodox Christian faith. And as I mentioned, you're going to encounter this. If you interact with people much at all, you're going to encounter this idea if you do much reading, because there are a number of people out there that are still popularizing this. Of course, Bauer-Ehrman does. But in addition to them, Elaine Pagels is a well-known scholar who promotes these ideas. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Okay, and so you probably remember the book, The Da Vinci Code, which was very popular, and then the movie that was made on the basis of the Da Vinci Code, the Da Vinci Code movie, which was really more popular than the book, really propagated this idea of the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, and that we really don't know, or we can't have any certainty as to which view of Jesus, which understanding of the life of Christ is really the true one. Okay. And so because these spokesmen are so well known and in some cases very articulate and very intelligent people, this particular view of Christianity has become quite popular. Okay, so people might ask you, well, how do you know your version of Christianity is the right version? There are these other versions that got suppressed and got squelched, and so there are a lot of people that grab into this idea, that grab hold of this thesis and take it for gospel truth. And so you even see it you see it propagated even by Jehovah's Witnesses. You see it propagated by Mormons. Certain aspects of this view are expressed in Mormonism. Okay. And one of the things that's one of the reasons that the Bauer-Ehrman thesis has caught on so much is because it syncs so well, S-Y-N-C, syncs so well with postmodernism and postmodern ideology. Okay, so according to postmodernism, as you recall, truth is only subjective, it's relative, everybody kind of has their own truth. And when a particular truth becomes the dominant truth in a community or in a culture, in a society, it does so simply as a function of power. So in other words, the people who are in power impose their truth on everybody else and get everybody else, or try to get everybody else linked into their truth, okay? But according to postmodernism, there is no universal truth, all right? There is no grand narrative. So the whole idea of a grand narrative is actually a power play on the part of the people in power to either assert or exert their power or to maintain their power, okay? So you can see that the Bauer-Ehrman thesis really plays into this whole idea, because this is the whole idea that we see with the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, is that there are all these multiple different beliefs, but the people who had the most power, the most political power, all right, not spiritual power, not spiritual credibility or whatever, but just simply as a factor of their political power, were able to force their view of truth on everybody else. So it's very postmodern in the way it thinks. Okay, but the facts. Actually, the historical facts really are quite different. So, in fact, what we think of as historic orthodoxy, so Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is God, the Orthodox understanding of the atonement of Christ's death on the cross and what it meant, what it accomplished, the doctrine of the Trinity, the resurrection, okay, these have all been clearly demonstrated now to be the Church's earliest understandings of Jesus and the earliest doctrines of the Church. So pretty much exclusively the doctrine and the view of the church until you get into the 2nd century. And in the 2nd century, you start to get some of these other ideas. All right? So the historic view of Jesus that is evidenced in the New Testament itself, and also in the creeds that are quoted in the New Testament. So remember, you have the New Testament, and then you have creeds in the New Testament that the New Testament is quoting. So obviously the creeds come earlier than the actual writing of the New Testament itself, okay? These are all very, very early, right? And the New Testament itself, of course, has been demonstrated to have been written within the lifetime of the apostles, so within the 1st century. So it's very clear that the teachings of the New Testament that we see, the claims of Christ's deity, the claims of his messiahship, what it says about his, these things all were in the documents of the earliest Christians, all right? In addition to that, we see the very early church fathers. So some of the church fathers were beginning to write at the very beginning of the 2nd century. Okay, so the church fathers are the leaders of the church after the passing of the apostles, and we have what we call the church fathers that go on for several centuries. But the very earliest church fathers, one of the things that we see in their writings is that they are exclusively Orthodox. Okay, they're exclusively Orthodox. We don't see any of these other so-called Christianities expressed in the writings of the earliest church fathers. And so it's very clear that the canon of the New Testament was beginning to be established by the end of the 1st century, and was becoming very, very much set in stone, so to speak, by the end of the 2nd century. There was still some debate. We've talked all about this, about the canon before. So there was still some debate, but pretty much by the end of the 2nd century, the canon was established. These are the books that we recognize are from God, okay, that are God's Word, and the other claiming texts or whatever were excluded from the canon. So we know this happened very early in the history of the church. And in addition to that, there's just no credible evidence, all right, that there was any other Christianity other than Orthodox Christianity that was prevalent at all in Alexandria, in Edessa, in Ephesus, and these other places in those early centuries, in those early centuries, and particularly in the 1st and 2nd century, first century and early 2nd century. It's very clear that Orthodox Christianity was basically the preeminent or the dominant faith in these various localities that the Bauer-Ehrman thesis claims actually believed other things. In addition to that, this claim that the Council of NIcea invented the idea of the Jesus of Nazareth, we're going to see in a little bit how that cannot be true. So in 325 AD, which was just about a decade after Constantine became the emperor, Constantine is the first, what we think of as the first Christian emperor of Rome, of the Roman Empire. And about a decade later, he called the Council of NIcea. And the idea is that people propagate about the Council of Nicaea. There are these various myths that people propagate about it. And one of them is that there was no church-wide orthodoxy or view of Jesus prior to this council. So the idea is that for the 250 years or whatever prior to the Council of Nicaea, there was no agreed orthodoxy. There were just all these various competing ideas, right? And then the idea, again, another myth, is that Constantine called the council because he wanted to impose the Roman version of Christianity on all these other Christian churches in these other regions. So the reason he called the council is supposedly because he wanted to impose the Roman view or the Roman interpretation. And then what you'll sometimes hear is that you get all these various Christians bishops together, Christian bishops together from all these various Christianities, and they all come together at the Council of Nicaea. and there's just an incredible free-for-all arguing and bickering and fighting and quarreling that goes on and on and on, until finally Constantine brings down the hammer and forces his will on the council. So the idea then, of course, is that the Council of Nicaea, under Constantine's control, invented the doctrine of the Trinity and the deity of Christ, or at least it was through Constantine's enforcement that the idea of the deity of Christ was propagated throughout all these various Christianities, and they were forced to accept it. So the idea then, of course, is that what we think of as modern Orthodox Christianity is those of us who hold to the historic faith of the church that we believe was the faith of the church from the very beginning, from Pentecost forward, okay, that this really is just the result of political manipulation, political power, the exercise of political power, and it really doesn't have any more claim to authenticity or credibility than any other number of ways that people think of Jesus. Okay? So these are the kinds of myths that you're going to run into. Well, how do you answer them? Well, in the first place, the council was, as I said, it was called by Constantine, but it was he called bishops. He actually sent out invitations to something like 1,500 bishops, but only about 300 were actually able to come. The vast majority of those were from Eastern Christendom, okay, from Constantinople and Asia Minor and East, and a handful came from Western Christianity, okay. And the idea was, what Constantine wanted to do is there had been a controversy that had arisen in the church by the 3rd century, by the beginning of the 4th century. There was a controversy brewing in the church about whether or not Jesus was God. And it was headed up by a guy named Arius. So it's called Arianism. And so there was this tension, this controversy in the church across the broad scope of the Greco-Roman world. Arius had, by the time of the council, the church in Alexandria had already declared him a heretic. Okay, so it was already clear this idea that Arianism was a heresy was already afoot in the church well before Constantine calls the council. Okay, but the reason he called the council is because he perceived this division within the church to be a threat. One of the reasons was he perceived that this division or this tension in the church was going to be a threat to the stability of the empire. Okay, so there was political motivation for why it was important that this thing get resolved. And I believe that he sincerely, as a believer, wanted to get an answer to this question. But he wasn't in a place to give the answer. He wasn't a church official, right? He was the emperor. Secondly, the council was not, as it's often described, as a free-for-all. It's just all these number of competing ideas. The dominant view of all the bishops who were there, the preeminent, dominant view was the Orthodox view. So it wasn't you had some of them were Orthodox and some Marcion and some this and some that and all that. It was the vast majority of them were Orthodox going into the council. There were Arius was there, and a handful of Arians were there as well to argue their case. Okay. So the resolution of this question about the nature of Jesus, is he God, is really the most significant accomplishment of the council. There were some other things they wrestled with, but this was the major issue. So the chief question that they were considering had to do with this idea of whether or not Jesus was of equal status with the Father. Okay, so is Jesus God on the same level of the Father, or is Jesus some kind of a lesser deity? All right, so that's really the question that's at stake. And Arius is arguing that no, Jesus is not co-equal with the Father, right? And so this is the idea then that was beginning to spread throughout the church, and this is the controversy that the council was called to address. And it is, of course, true that Constantine attended the council, and that he apparently participated at some level. Now, historians aren't exactly sure, and they have different opinions about to what degree Constantine was involved in the deliberations. But we have to keep in mind who these bishops are and what time this is. This is 325 AD. Okay, this is just barely 10 years after the most severe persecution that Christianity had endured came to an end in 313 AD. So in 313 AD, the worst persecution of the church in its history ended. So the vast majority of these bishops are people who were still bishops. They were still leaders in the church, okay? 10 years later, these are guys who had stood up to Caesar, right? They had stood up to the empire. They had done so at the risk of their lives. Their friends, their fellow workers, family members, and others had been persecuted, some executed or put to death. They'd had their property stolen. These were not the kind of guys who were inclined to just buckle when the emperor said something. These are clearly people who were very strong individuals who had survived the worst persecution in church history up to that point. Okay? So Constantine is there, and he's participating at some level, but he doesn't dictate what the bishops are to decide. There's no indication that Constantine dictated the outcome. There's no indication that he was the one who composed the first version of the Nicene Creed. There's no indication that he had to sign off on the creed or anything like that. His issue was not that he wanted his particular viewpoint established. His point was he wanted the church united. He wanted one church. Okay? And then, as I said, the council did not invent Orthodox Christianity, because we see clearly that Orthodox Christianity starts clear back in the first century. We can see that from the New Testament documents. We can see it from the writings of the Church Fathers. We can see it in the early creeds that are quoted in the New Testament. So it's very clear that this idea that Jesus is God was not invented at Nicaea. What was particularly new at Nicaea, the thing that was particularly significantly new at Nicaea is how the church fathers, or these bishops, how they agreed to define Jesus' relationship to the Father. Okay, and they used a word that was it was debated to some degree as was this the best word to use, but they settled on the word homoousios. Okay, which is a word that means the same, homo, nature. Okay, so in the creed they included the word homoousios to say that Jesus was the same nature as the Father. Okay, so in doing so they rejected a couple other ways of expressing Jesus' relationship with the Father. So they rejected the possibility of saying that Jesus was of a similar nature to the Father. So they specifically rejected that. All right? And they rejected, of course, the idea that Jesus was in some kind of a lesser God than the Father. So this whole idea of homoousios, Jesus is of the same nature, the same essence. And one of the things we talked about early on in our philosophy lessons is the importance of that idea of essence, that everything has a single essence. And so when we say that they are of the same essence, we are saying they are God. One God, three persons. Okay? And of course, the deity of Christ has clear implications for the question of the Trinity. Is there a Trinity? Okay, and it has clear implications for that. But Nicaea didn't wrestle with that question. So the argument sometimes is made that Nicaea, that the doctrine of the Trinity came out of Nicaea, and that's simply not true. The Council of Nicaea did not deal with the question of Trinity. They were dealing with the question of the nature of Jesus. So after the Council makes its decision, writes the Nicene Creed, you have a copy of the original Nicene Creed and then a copy of the Revised Creed that was arrived at the Council of Constantinople a number of years later. You have a copy of both of those on your handout. But after the creed is written, after the bishops sign off on it, it becomes the official statement of the council, and Arius is actually declared a heretic, and by the broader church. Okay, and of course he leaves, but he doesn't give up. Right? And so as it turns out, if the intention of I almost said Columbus, if the intention of Constantine was to squelch and totally annihilate Arianism, he did a lousy job of it, because after the Council of NIcea, Arianism continued to grow, and it actually became more and more influential, and actually later in his life, Constantine actually embraced Arianism and wanted to bring Arius back into the church. He died before he was able to do that. So clearly Arianism did not die out, and of course it still hasn't died out today. It's still out there, right? So as I mentioned, the Mormons propagate it, the Jehovah's Witnesses propagate it, and many people have this kind of an idea of Jesus. So those thoughts are just to kind of equip you to be ready to deal with this whole idea of the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, and this idea that Orthodox Christianity just isn't particularly credible or authentic. But now I want to go on, and I want to talk about the second subject I want to talk about today, which is Christianity's relationship and its influence in Western civilization going forward from the time of the early church and forward into today. Okay, and there are a number here again. There are just a number of misperceptions and myths about Christianity and the impact of Christianity on Western civilization, that sort of thing. And one of the mistaken ideas that people have, and you'll encounter this in various places in reading stuff, is that in the Roman Empire, in those centuries in which the church is just getting started and growing and beginning to expand, that the Roman Empire constituted a very growing, vibrant, intellectual and technological culture. Okay, so there's this perception of this great vibrancy and intellectual curiosity and progress and that sort of thing in Rome, and that when Christianity gained influence and became eventually dominant in the Roman Empire, that this squelched all this vibrant intellectual endeavor in the Roman Empire. Okay, and then that precipitates eventually the fall of the Roman Empire, right? And following the fall of the Roman Empire, with all of this supposed intellectual progress and vibrancy and that sort of thing, with the fall of Rome, then Western civilization is plunged into a terrible period that is oftentimes referred to as the Dark Ages, that lasts for 1,000 years. And so Christianity defeated intellectual inquiry and technological advancement and that sort of thing in the latter Roman Empire period, or the Roman period, and then eventually led to the fall of Rome, and then that plunged the West into this terrible period of what's called the Dark Ages, or the Age of Faith, as opposed to the Age of Reason. So you get this whole tension between faith and reason that we have talked about in earlier lessons. And so then you get this 1,000-year period of the Dark Ages. And through the Dark Ages, the reason they are dark and the reason they stay dark is because the church is aggressively resisting and suppressing any cultural progress or scientific progress or technological progress or even intellectual, philosophical progress, that the church is just so focused on getting people to believe their dogma that all these other ideas and endeavors are squelched, are suppressed, or are resisted. And kind of the epitome of the example of this is supposedly the burning of the library in Alexandria at the end of the 4th century, 390 AD. And so there was supposedly, historians are not settled on this, but there was supposedly a library in Alexandria that was burned. Many volumes were destroyed, although it's highly questionable whether it was 700,000 volumes or whatever. But there's all kinds of problems with this whole story. But whatever the case may be, the idea is the reason the library was burned because it contained all this, quote, profane or non-religious, all these non-religious volumes. And so there was just tremendous loss to civilization in the loss of all this intellectual material that was burned. And it certainly was, if to what degree there was such a fire and to what degree volumes were lost. That certainly is a loss to civilization that we should regret. The question is that an example of the church's opposition to what we might think of as profane learning or non-religious learning, right? This is a fairly involved story in our longer lessons, so you can get these if you listen to these lessons online on our website. You can get the fuller story of the burning of the library there. But that is supposedly an example of this resistance and opposition of the church. And then the idea is, after you go for 1,000 years through this age of faith, then suddenly the shackles of church dogma are shed. You enter into the Renaissance period. You enter into this great rebirth of learning and art and philosophy and all that sort of thing. And we enter into the age of reason. So we leave the age of faith and we enter into the age of reason, beginning with the Renaissance and followed then by the Enlightenment. And then again, one of the kind of epitome examples of this war between the church and science is, of course, Galileo. So Galileo is often cited as kind of the classic example of the church's opposition. So as the myth goes, Galileo is just an example of what the church did throughout its history. So Galileo is seen as the rule, when in fact, as we'll see, Galileo was the exception rather than the rule. Where do these myths come from? Well, actually, they've been out there for a very long time. So you have a number of people, most of these names you'll probably recognize. But this first guy you may know, Zosimus. Okay, he was a pagan Byzantine. He lived in the Byzantine Empire. He was a pagan. He was very opposed to Christianity, and he propagated some of these views of Christian history. Voltaire, of course, is an Enlightenment philosopher, very anti-Christian philosopher. He propagated and furthered these myths. Edward Gibbon's book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, contains much of this material that we've just been talking about. John William Draper wrote a book towards the end of the 19th century. He wrote a book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And he tried to give examples and argue that throughout the entire history of the church, it has been opposed to, it's been at war with science. Thomas Huxley, sometimes called Darwin's bulldog, he was an agnostic. He was a very avid evolutionist, of course, and he also propagated some of these myths. And Bertrand Russell. Okay, so he's an aristocratic British philosopher and mathematician and historian and much more. So he's a brilliant guy. And as I mentioned here in your notes, he's a self-described atheist or agnostic. And he also repeats these. So over and over again, down through history, these myths have been repeated over and over and over again, and other myths about Christianity's relationship in history. And so they're very deeply entrenched. I learned some of these myths when I was in grade school and when I was in high school. Very early I learned them, and you probably have heard them over and over again yourself, and they are still widely expressed. So let's go back and let's actually look at what happened, and let's look at the history of things. To do so, let's go back and let's start with what has been called the Greek miracle. So you have a period of about 300 years in Greece between about 600 BC and about 300 BC, in which there's just an explosion in Greece of intellectual activity, development in the fields of philosophy and literature, in art, even in technology, political concepts, ideas of democracy and things like that, and even progress in military aspects and how to do war and that sort of. So there's this tremendous explosion of knowledge that occurs in Greece from about 600 to 300, roughly 300 BC. But then, and that miracle, that explosion, is really considered by many people to be really kind of the beginning of the road to modernity. So where we are today started, as far as our breadth of knowledge and understanding, our technology and science, and everything, where we are today started with the Greek miracle, all right? But as I mentioned, you get to about 338 BC, 300 BC, and this Greek miracle begins to wane, all right? It begins to diminish, and it loses steam. And one of the reasons it did so is because up until this time, you just had a number of independent Greek states. So they had all these independent states, and there was competition between them and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of impetus to improve your status, right? Because you're competing against all these other city-states and that sort of thing. But you get to this later period, and Greece begins to consolidate itself into several empires, like the Athenian Empire. So they began to consolidate these city-states into empires. And what happens with empires is they become very focused on expanding and maintaining the empire. And so a lot of energy that could be directed elsewhere gets directed into the energies of the empire. Okay? And so this is what happened to the Greek miracle, is as the Greek city-states began to be coalesced or grouped together or conquered or whatever, and assembled into these more cohesive empires, the energy then goes into the empire and it's sapped out of the Greek miracle. Okay, and this is significant because that's not the only time it happened in history. Okay, but actually, one of the things that Christianity does as it comes along is it sees a lot of this Greek knowledge, Greek understanding, and that sort of thing, and of course the early Christians had knowledge of Greek. They knew Greek, so they could read the Greek literature and that sort of thing. And so the church is actually responsible for preserving much of that fruit of the Greek miracle. Okay? But let's go a little further west and let's look at Rome. Because I mentioned that Rome was believed to be this really vibrant, intellectually vibrant place until Christianity came along and killed it all, right? But the fact is that most of that intellectual energy that we see in Rome and vibrancy and the ideas and that sort of thing are actually borrowed from Greece. So after Rome conquers Greece, then they're able to assimilate a lot of this Greek knowledge and understanding and that sort of thing into the Roman Empire, and that's what happens. And so Rome appears to be on the cutting edge of intellectual endeavor, when in fact it's simply taking what it had conquered from the Greeks and using themselves. We'll see this happens again later in history with another empire. The fact is that when that intellectual energy that existed in Rome, that again was really a fruit of the Greek miracle, when that began to die was at the same time that Rome became an empire. And so you have the same thing happened with intellectual vibrancy. The same thing happens in Rome that happened in Greece, that when the focus becomes more and more on the building and the maintaining of empire, that saps the energy out of this intellectual endeavor. Further, when it comes to the question of the fall of Rome, historians really don't know. They just don't know what caused the fall of Rome. So one historian has counted 200 different reasons that are given for the fall of Rome by various historians. Okay, so there's no really agreed opinion about what caused the fall of Rome, but there's certainly no evidence that it was Christianity that caused the fall of Rome. Okay, there's just no evidence of that. And one of the reasons I would be inclined to not believe that Christianity caused the fall of the Roman Empire is because the Roman Empire was divided into two parts. You had the western part, of which Rome was the capital, and then you had the eastern part of the empire, of which Constantinople was the capital, or the seat of power. Okay, and that eastern part, after the fall of Rome, became known as the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so what's striking is that Rome fell in the early part of the 5th century, but the Byzantine Empire continues on in one form or another, continues on heavily influenced by Christianity for another 1,000 years. So the question is, if Christianity brought an end to the Western Roman Empire, why didn't Christianity affect the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, which continued as an empire, as we say, for another 1,000 years? So, actually, the fall of Rome, and again, people aren't settled on exactly what caused it, but one of the chief causes seems to be that Rome really made some mistakes, really made some serious mistakes in their long-term strategic policies. Okay, these changes actually exposed Rome ultimately to the barbarians, to the northern Europeans. So Rome's military defeat, and we do know when they were defeated and to some degree why, Rome's military defeat that really brought an end to the empire was in part caused by these altered defensive strategies. So they changed the way they were defending the empire. And they had a very successful plan in place that was working, and then they changed it. And that had some very negative effects. And one of the effects that it had is it diminished military training. It diminished the training of the effectiveness of the training of the soldiers, and it also decreased the discipline of the troops. So one of the things we think of the Roman soldiers is we think about how well trained they were and how well disciplined they were. Well, that then begins to be eroded by these new strategic policies. While this is happening, the northern barbarians, the Germanic tribes, and those who have been doing battle with the Roman soldiers over all these centuries are learning how the Romans fight. And they're implementing those strategies and those tactics in their own warfare. So they're getting better soldiers, they're getting better at war, and Rome is losing its power. And so eventually, of course, Rome falls. But with the fall of Rome, then, of course, the myth is that Western civilization is plunged into this long period of darkness, of intellectual darkness. But the fact is that in the short period after Rome fell, so in the next decades and centuries after the fall of Rome, in the early medieval Europe, you begin to see some really significant developments that really made a difference in the way people lived and made a difference in people's lifestyles. So, for example, in the field of agriculture, you have, shortly after the fall of Rome, you have the development of the iron plow. Well, you can imagine what a difference it made for agriculture when they're no longer using wood to plow the soil with. You can imagine how quickly the wood would deteriorate. But when you have iron plows, you're able to have sharper plows. You're able to have more durable plows. You're able to produce more food, right? Also, there was a development, and this seems so conspicuous to us, but for millennia, people didn't know about this, didn't have any idea. But the invention of the padded horse collar. Okay, so before the padded horse collar, of course, horses were limited in how much they could pull because the horse collars were so painful for a horse. They irritate the horse. But when they developed the padded horse collar, that made it possible to work horses longer, for horses to be able to pull more weight. And so this is a tremendous boon to agriculture. And this is reflected in the growing population in Europe, is that Europe is able to feed more people. In the area of industry, this is a fascinating thing, that before the fall of Rome, people knew about wind power and they knew about water power. The Romans knew about it, they didn't develop it. And the reason they didn't develop it is because they didn't need to, because they had so many slaves. Okay, so there was no need to have the wind work for you and to invest in building windmills or whatever, or water mills. There was no need to go to that expense because we had this cheap labor, right? We had these slaves. When that comes to an end and when the slaves are then freed, then there becomes the need to find a way to produce energy through wind and water. Right? And so you have, after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the development of wind power and the development of water power. In the area of transportation, things we just take for granted every day. All right? So after the fall of Rome, there was the invention of the wheel brake on wagons. Up to that point, nobody had ever thought of putting a brake on a wheel on a wagon. Okay? You can imagine the difference that this made in transportation. In addition to that, they developed the swiveling front axle. So now so instead of the axle being stiff and the wheels being drug around a corner, you can imagine what that does. Okay, now you could have you could have your axle on a swivel, and it was much easier then to navigate, to go around corners and that sort of thing. These are just some of the, to us, very obvious things that happened, or that we think about today. We just take them for granted, but these things were invented and began to be used in these decades and centuries immediately after the fall of Rome. You had also development in the area of arts, and you had developments in the area of warfare following the fall of Rome. And then there's this issue of all this Greek learning that's out there. The Greek learning that's there from the Greek miracle, and then also from even later Greek development. Okay, so most of this vibrant intellectual activity of the Greco-Roman world, as I've mentioned, was the product of the Greeks, right? And therefore it was written in Greek. So all of this stuff was written in Greek. But with the conquering of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, the conquering of it by the Northern Europeans, the Germanic tribes and others of the Northern Europeans, as they come in and they conquered these lands, then there's really no need for Greek. Okay, so the whole Greek language gets lost. Knowledge of the Greek language gets pretty much lost in the Western Roman Empire after the fall of Rome. So scholars in particularly the earlier medieval era in Western Europe didn't have access to all of this Greek learning and all this Greek knowledge. Okay, they lost access to it. But while that's going on, while Europe is losing some access, you still have the Byzantine Empire, so it's still there, and of course it's primarily speaking Greek, and so the Byzantine Empire still has this information, so there's still a lot of intellectual activity going on in the Byzantine Empire. But then the Byzantine Empire, just like Rome eventually fell to the Northern European tribes, the Byzantine Empire begins to fall piece by piece to the Islamic conquest, right? So as the Islamic Arabs begin to come across what we think of as modern day Turkey and keep taking off more and more pieces of the Byzantine Empire, they are now gaining access to this knowledge. Okay, and the way that happens is they're conquering these Greek-speaking peoples and these Greek-speaking scholars. Right, they're conquering them. All right, and so they're absorbing them into their culture. So you have all these Greek-speaking, what are called dominies, the conquered peoples. Okay, and so you have all these Greek-speaking scholars now absorbed into the Arabic world. All right, and so while this is going on, then eventually in the latter medieval period, you begin then the Western Europeans, the people in what was formerly the Western Roman Empire, those people begin to reclaim the knowledge of Greek. They begin to learn Greek again, and they began then finally to tap into this tremendous knowledge that's available through the Greeks. In a few minutes, we'll come back to this issue of what happened with these dominies who were absorbed into the Arabic culture. But again, there's this idea that Christianity has been at war with science from its very beginning. So let's think about that for a minute. One thing that stands out, particularly with the Christian worldview, is the whole idea of the possibility of progress, or the idea of progress. Okay, and Rodney Stark, one of the authors I mentioned at the beginning, says that the idea of progress was inherent in Jewish conceptions of history and was central to Christian thought from the very early days. Okay, so this idea of progress, it's something we just take for granted. But as it turns out, this whole idea of progress was really revolutionary in the Greco-Roman world and in the world in general. So that Moses Finley, who's a well-known 20th century classical scholar, he says that the European idea of progress is unique in human history. So this whole idea of progress is possible and progress is good, and we can accomplish this, we can move forward, we can better our circumstances. This whole idea is revolutionary. It's new, and one of the reasons for that is because pagan cultures and pagan religions had, as we talked about before, had this circular view of history. So if you're going in a circle, you're never going to make progress. So you don't think in terms of progress, right? It's just not a concept you embrace. But in Christianity, in Judaism and in Christianity, time is seen as linear. It has a beginning point and it has a telos. It has something it's moving to. And so this lends itself to the idea of progress and to the value of progress. Okay, so this is a revolutionary idea that permeates Western civilization. Okay, so this actually becomes characteristic of Western civilization with the rise of Christianity. So when we get then into the medieval era, after the fall of Rome, we get into the medieval period and moving forward. Science and discovery actually become very extensive. So instead of being this dark ages that is talked about, it's actually a time of great, as we've seen, a time of great progress. And the fact is, all the major scientific discoveries that we think about that were the breakthrough during the period of the Renaissance and later, and what's called the scientific revolution or the Copernican revolution. Okay. The big discoveries that were made at that time were all built upon the discoveries and ideas that grew out of the medieval era, and those scientists who were making those profound discoveries that we think of today as profound as these great scientific leaps forward. The scientists who did those acknowledged that they couldn't have gotten there if they hadn't been standing on the shoulders of these brilliant men and women who lived even hundreds of years before them. So what that means is that during that period, that medieval period, beginning in the early medieval period, but then gaining momentum as you move forward in time, you have just this tremendous, extensive development, intellectual, scientific, technological, philosophical, arts. Also, you get this tremendous development that just absolutely eclipses anything that's going on anywhere else in the world. Okay? Which brings us to this whole question then of the myth of the Dark Ages. And we'll come back to this idea of the rest of the world in just a minute. But so you have this myth of the Dark Ages, and this term, the Dark Ages, was actually coined by somebody in the 14th century, so right towards the end of the medieval era. Okay, and the idea again is that supposedly for 1,000 years following the fall of Rome, there was nothing. There was just nothing of any significant intellectual, scientific, or technological or artistic significance that occurred. Okay, it was just a completely black, dark period, and the reason is because faith was seen as the antithesis to reason. And so we just shunned all reason and logic and that sort of thing, and all we had to do was just believe. And this is supposedly how people viewed things during that period of time. And during that period of time, then Christianity was at war with science, and of course Galileo was just the classic example of that war that went on. The reality is there were no Dark Ages. Okay? Historians today, virtually all historians of that era today, reject the whole concept of the Dark Ages at virtually every point. Okay? So this is not just Christian historians, but this is all historians recognize the mythology of the supposed Dark Ages. The medieval era was in fact a period of very vibrant intellectual activity, scientific activity, technological advancement, and that sort of thing. And what is important to recognize is that virtually all of this growth, all of this development was financed by the church and took place, most of it took place in the universities, and the universities were an invention of the church. The church invented universities. It founded the universities and it funded the universities, and this is where much of this intellectual activity was going on. In addition to that, nearly all of the really great intellectual minds of the medieval era, and even as we move forward into the Renaissance, virtually all of them were Christians. And only a very small percentage were secular in any regard. So what we need to recognize then is that the church, throughout the medieval era and throughout the Renaissance, historically supported and encouraged scientific inquiry and intellectual endeavors. So instead of the church being at war with science, the church is the reason science became what it was. The church was the chief patron of science. All the early universities were founded and supported by the church. Virtually all the early Christians or early scientists, including Copernicus and including Galileo, were professing Christians. So Rodney Stark again, in his book How the West Won, says, contrary to the conventional narrative, science did not suddenly flourish once Europe cast aside religious superstitions during the so-called Enlightenment. Science arose in the West, and only in the West, precisely because the Judeo-Christian conception of God encouraged and even demanded this pursuit. So this totally demolishes this whole Christianity versus science myth that is so prevalent in the world today. Now, I mentioned that these kind of developments, this kind of advancement was taking place in the West, and as Stark points out and others point out, it wasn't happening anywhere else. It wasn't happening anywhere else in the world. Now, it is true that, for example, in China, you have a number of very significant inventions that take place, right? And you've read about those. So things like the invention of gunpowder and cannon, the invention of of mechanical clocks, the invention of the printing press. As I recall, I believe there's some dispute as whether that was invented in China first or in the United States, in Europe first. But the point is, the Chinese were developing very significant inventions. But what's curious about that is that because the Chinese lack this idea of progress, they never really saw what they could do with these inventions, how these inventions were not just simply a really cool thing to have, but they were actually a stepping stone to something further, something even better, okay? And they didn't recognize that. So it's very striking that the Chinese invented the mechanical clock, but the Mandarin court ordered that all the clocks be destroyed because they didn't understand the significance and the value of what they had. Another example of this is this Chinese explorer Zheng He, who built some ships and traveled from China around and explored in India, and then sailed over to Eastern Africa and explored Africa, and then sailed back to China. And he made these trips, these exploratory trips, and he brought things back. He brought exotic animals back and that sort of thing from Africa. But instead of recognizing the value of this exploration and what he was learning, this was a threat to the Chinese powers that be. And so the emperor ordered the destruction of all seagoing vessels. Actually, no more seagoing vessels could be built, and Zheng He's own vessels were destroyed. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is not that there weren't developments in other parts of the world, but there was nothing like what you see in Western civilization. So it was really up to the Christian West to appreciate the value of these inventions and these discoveries, and then to take them and use them and develop even greater things, okay? And so this happens in Europe, and it doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Okay? And then one of the last things I want to talk about is, well, what about Islam? And here again, there's a lot of misunderstanding that needs to be clarified. So the common view that's held in the West of Islamic culture during the medieval era, the era that many Westerners think of as the Dark Ages in Europe. So these are the Dark Ages in Europe, and while Europe is beclouded and darkened by all this anti-reason, anti-profane learning mentality, while this is going on, in the Islamic world, you have a flourishing of intellectual exploration, mathematics and philosophy, and that sort of thing. So oftentimes people like to draw that contrast and talk about this tremendous intellectual growth and development in the Islamic world during that period. But in reality, what happened was, remember we talked about the Islamic conquest, and as they conquered these people and they absorbed these learned scholars into their cultures, okay, and these scholars and all of this Greek material, the Greek learning, the books, and that sort of thing, then get absorbed into the Islamic Arabic communities and countries, right? So actually, much of what people look at, they just kind of look superficially at this Islamic flowering that they see, and they attribute it to Islam, and they attribute it to the Muslim people as though they're the ones who originate, when actually in most cases, probably not all, but certainly in most cases, this is simply the product of the Dominis, the conquered peoples, who are now absorbed. They're now speaking Arabic. They're writing in Arabic. They're actually translating these Greek texts into Arabic, and so much of the Greek knowledge that was lost to the West with the conquest of the Roman Empire, much of that then was absorbed into the Islamic world with the conquest of the Byzantine Empire. All right. And then what happens over a period of time, as the generations go on, then these conquered peoples then just get melded into the conquering peoples. They become basically one with them, and they lose their original faith. They lose. They become Muslims, and of course they no longer are familiar with the Greek and that sort of thing. So one of the things that's fascinating. What the Dominis are doing is they're bringing all this Greek learning, all this development, intellectual development. They're bringing this into the Arab communities, into the Arabic world. Okay, but they're also translating these things into Arabic, and they are also adopting Arabic names. The longer they live in these areas, they adopt Arabic names, and so it looks on the surface as if all of this flowering and everything is Islamic in its origin, when in fact most of it is not. Most of it is actually a product of the Islamic conquest. Okay, but then as the Dominis become progressively converted to Islam and distanced in time from their original culture, as this goes on over generations, this goes on, and the intellectual and scientific vibrancy of the Islamic world then diminishes and then virtually dies out. So nobody today thinks of the Islamic world, looks up to the Islamic world as a source of intellectual vibrancy and exploration and discovery and that sort of thing. Okay, you don't get that because it doesn't grow out of Islamic faith. It doesn't grow out of the Islamic worldview. It grows out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. Okay, and for that reason, you don't have any world. You don't have any, or very few at least, world-leading universities in Arabic countries. Okay. Because, again, the Muslim way of looking at things, the Islamic way of looking at things, doesn't engender this idea of progress and making progress and exploring and growing intellectually and that sort of thing. So that's a very condensed module on history. We covered it in only 2 weeks. Next week we want to go into our module on the life and death of Jesus. So we're going to talk about Jesus next week. We're going to talk about Jesus in history, and then after that module, we'll do a module on the resurrection. So that's where we're going next week. So see you all next week.